Hello again, this is Alister McGrath, continuing a series of presentations on C.S. Lewis. And in the second presentation on Lewis, I'm going to look at why Lewis gave up on his early atheism. As many of you will know, Lewis was a trenchant atheist by the age of 16. He was quite clear religion had been explained away by the leading scholars of the 1910s. He was convinced the best scholarship of the day had shown religion was just a primitive human instinct which was discredited by scientific advance. And like Richard Dawkins a century later, Lewis argued that we've grown up. We don't need God anymore. No one can take religion seriously anymore. We've outgrown God. And Lewis's views were hardened by the suffering and violence he witnessed while serving in the British Army during the First World War. As I mentioned in the last presentation, Lewis had trained in an officer cadet battalion in Oxford during the summer of 1917 before being commissioned as an officer in the Somerset Light Infantry and posted to northern France. And the suffering and the destruction that Lewis saw around him convinced him of the pointlessness of life and the non-existence of God. Lewis's experiences during the First World War made him angry with God. How dare God create him without his permission? Yet he realized that his atheism did not provide him with a framework of meaning that made any sense of the devastation and anguish caused by the war. If there was no God, then blame for the war's horrors and traumas had to be laid firmly on human beings. And like many at the time, Lewis seems to have realized that the violence and the brutality of the war raised really difficult questions about a godless humanism as much as it did about Christianity. And what Lewis called his grim and deadly atheism did not make much sense of Lewis's wartime trauma, let alone help him to cope with it. The literature about the Great War and its aftermath does emphasize the psychological and physical damage it caused to soldiers at the time and on their return home. And the irrationality of the war called into question for many whether there was any meaning in the universe or individual existence. And many of these damaged and traumatized soldiers returned to study as students at Oxford University after the war. And they experienced considerable difficulty in adjusting to normal life. Frequently, they had nervous breakdowns. And Lewis himself, interestingly, hardly ever mentions the Great War. He seems to have partitioned or compartmentalized his life as a way of retaining his sanity. And literature played a very important role in keeping Lewis sane. It was his firewall against the chaotic and meaningless world. It helped him to keep this at a safe distance and shielded him from the existential devastation that it caused to other people. Now, in the 1920s, Lewis was still an atheist. He was convinced it was right, even though he admitted it offered a grim and meaningless view of life. Lewis didn't regard atheism as being liberating or exciting. He seems to have simply accepted it without any great enthusiasm as a thinking person's only intellectual option, despite it being tone deaf to human emotions and offering only existential bleakness. But during the 1920s, Lewis began to reconsider things. Looking back on his time as an atheist, Lewis was shocked at how easily he had been unthinkingly captivated by an atheist ideology. As he wrote in Surprised by Joy, "I must have been blind as a bat, not to have seen long before the ludicrous contradiction between my theory of life and my actual experiences." In the end, the power of the atheist's big picture was only broken finally when he realized that Christianity offered a better big picture. And Lewis discovered that the compelling Christian big story of creation and redemption was far more powerful, more appealing, and more realistic. Now, Lewis's discovery here was not purely rational, but it involved his imagination and his intuitions. Because after wrestling with the clues concerning God he found in human reason and experience, he eventually decided that intellectual honesty compelled him to believe and trust in God. And in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Lewis tells us how he experienced the gradual approach of God. It was, he suggests, like a game of chess. Every move he made to try and defend himself was countered by a better move on God's part. And finally he felt he had no option but to give in and admit that God was God, becoming what he described as the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. So what made Lewis change his mind? How did this dogmatic atheist become one of the greatest apologists for Christianity of the 20th century? And what can we learn from this? So let's begin by looking at how Lewis's disenchantment with atheism began and where it took him. There are clear signs that Lewis began to become disenchanted with atheism in the early 1920s. For a start, it was imaginatively uninteresting. Lewis began to realize that atheism might be right, but it didn't and it couldn't satisfy the deepest longings of his heart, or his intuition that there was more to life than what was seen on the surface. And Lewis put it like this in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless. And Lewis began to realize that his glib and shallow rationalism dismissed the deep questions of life, offering only dismissive and superficial responses. Atheism was existentially deficient and unsatisfying, having nothing to say about the deepest questions of the human mind or the yearnings of the human heart. We can prove shallow, superficial and unimportant things, but the things that really matter, the truths by which we live, whether they're political, moral or religious, simply can't be proved in this way. And Lewis began to realize he'd allowed himself to be trapped into some kind of rationalist cage or prison. He had limited reality to what reason could prove. But what, he wondered, if there was something beyond the range of human reason? And what if this greater world dropped hints of its existence into our own world? What if an archer from that greater world were to shoot arrows into ours, alerting us to its existence? And Lewis began to realize the world around us and our own experience were full of clues to the meaning of the universe. And gradually Lewis realized that these hints and clues pointed to a world beyond the frontiers of reason. We may sense its fragrance wafted towards us by a gentle breeze on a cool evening. Or we may read others who've discovered this land and are ready to share these discoveries with us. All these signals of transcendence, to use a very nice phrase from the American sociologist Peter Berger, help us to realize there is more to existence than our everyday experience. Now, Lewis was a great admirer of the British apologist G.K. Chesterton. And Chesterton once pointed out that the human imagination is forced to reach beyond the limits of reason to find its true object. And Chesterton argued every true artist feels their touching transcendental truths, that their images are shadows of things seen through the veil. And Lewis knew that experience. He came to realize there was something beyond his experience speaking to him, drawing him towards its greater reality. In other words, God. Lewis felt he was drawn to this greater reality beyond the scope of reason and experience, but which reason and experience point towards, as if they are some kind of signposts along the road of life. And Lewis explored this in a remarkable wartime sermon of 1941, preached at University Church in Oxford, called The Weight of Glory. And in this sermon, Lewis spoke of a desire which no natural happiness can satisfy, which is signposted by, but not satisfied by human experience. It was as if he was standing by a closed door, and on the other side of this door was a new world, a new way of existing, which invited him to discover it and enter in. And in Surprised by Joy, Lewis tells us how he finally decided to open that door and step into this strange new world. Listen to these words. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in, admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. So in the next presentation, we'll look at this more closely. Was Lewis really converted in 1929? I'm going to suggest to you it might have happened a year later. So join me again soon and see what you think. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Thank you so much for listening.